So one of Luke's priorities is to focus on how God offers inclusion to the unexpected, to the undeserving. And that was what we saw last week as we went through Jesus' selection of his messengers and how that, relates to our own situation too. And it really just is at the core of his message, which is especially true in what we're going to be looking at today in what's probably his best known sermon, even though this version of it, Luke's, is maybe a little bit more obscure, but it's called the Sermon on the Plain. And what we're going to see here is how the Son of God came to bless those who recognize their need for him. And then once we have, we then need to offer his blessings to others, even those that we might be tempted to see as undeserving, because we ought to recognize ourselves in them. And so for this, we're going to be in Luke chapter 6 today. And as of course is on your handouts, hopefully you're already there. But if not, go ahead and find your way to Luke chapter 6, either your Bible on your phone, or if you need one, we do have some Bibles over on the counter there. We're going to be starting with verse 17. It says that Jesus came down with his apostles, this is right after their selection, and stood on a level place with a crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and be healed of their diseases, as well as those who were tormented with unclean spirits. And they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for power went out from him and healed them all. So at this point, the word about Jesus has gone far and wide, and it's drawing in huge crowds. And this is a huge crowd of Jewish people. But it's not just the Jewish people of Galilee, which is the region that he was from, where most of his ministry took place. There's a lot of them, but here we're told also that there have been Jewish people traveled up from Judea proper, the area around Jerusalem. But then even on top of that, there's also people from Tyre and Sidon. Now that doesn't necessarily mean much to everybody, but those are regions further up the Mediterranean coast, and they were Gentile. These were not Jewish people at all. And that's the point that Luke is really making by talking about them, is that, again, you have outsiders, unexpected people who are receiving the blessing of God. But of course, we do have to be on the lookout for what that blessing means, because these people, the reason why they're there is because they want miracles. They want immediate relief from the things that they are suffering. And Jesus does offer that to them here. But we have to be mindful of their purpose. That's what we've continued to focus on as we've gone through here, is that his displays of power are in service to the authority of his message. That's what he really wants to drive home. He has a greater goal in mind. And so after giving them these things that they initially came for, then he gives them more by speaking to them. That's what we find with the sermon starting in earnest at verse 20. It says that he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you, when they exclude you and revile you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for indeed your reward is great in heaven. For in like manner their fathers did to the prophets." Now, as I said earlier, Luke's version is a little bit different than the other more famous one, the Sermon on the Mount. And so if you've ever heard that phrase, that comes from, the phrase itself actually doesn't, but the idea of it comes from the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 5 to chapter 7 is where that takes place. And there's actually enough differences between them to suggest that they might not have even been the same event. Now, maybe if you're thinking, well, of course they're not. This one's on a level place and that one was on a mountain. That's not the reason why. Mountains can have level places. So it is possible that it's just two different ways to describe the same location. It's actually more the differences in what Jesus says that makes me kind of think, and a lot of other people, that it's not the same day that's being described. And it's more likely that it's kind of what you would call a keynote address. And a lot of people do this. When they travel to a lot of different places, speaking to different groups, they'll repeat themselves because they have the same things that they want to emphasize. So I tend to think that's what's going on here. Now, as far as the differences, you do see them very clearly right off the bat in these Beatitudes, or blessings, is what that means. And of course, Jesus has repeated multiple blessings here. But this is actually a shorter list than the one in Matthew. There's a fair few more of them. The other difference that's important, though, is who he blesses. Because it's here that we see that it's the poor, not the poor in spirit, which is the version that Matthew gives. And it's also the hungry, not those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're the ones who are blessed. And the reason why that's important, it's really important to have both of them, is because if we're only looking at Matthew, then we might be tempted to over-spiritualize it and not think about anybody who is hungry and thirsty and poor in this world right now, and think that it's only about those who are needy in comparison to God. That is certainly what it means, but it is also about those who are actually needy right now. So Luke is helping us to see that these blessings are both for the here and the hereafter, to allow us to tie that together. Jesus has a heart for the lowly of this world, the people who are most prone to be overlooked. He wants their needs to be met, but then it's in service to more. We are supposed to do that. We are supposed to be loving in order to point people to heaven. And, of course, that's the other thing that Jesus is doing here, is pointing beyond the world, pointing beyond the temporary. Because he's not really saying that these people are never going to struggle with these things. He's just saying that they're blessed for going through them. Because that's the point. There isn't always necessarily immediate relief. There are times when the followers of Jesus are not going to have enough in this world. Times when they will be sorrowful. And times when people turn against them. And so the promise of these blessings is not that following Jesus just eliminates these things out of our lives, it's that these times won't last. What is for now will not be forever. And in the end, we will be perfectly satisfied when we join Christ in the joy of his kingdom. That's our reason to persevere through whatever it is that we are lacking or suffering. And yes, it does hurt us when people exclude us and shun us, which is what we tend to experience in our culture or in other cultures and times, and they go further, hurt us even more directly. But if it's for Christ's sake, then we're at least in good company as we go through that. And we have to remember, what we're gaining is far better than what we're losing out on for just right now. Where, for people on the other side who are causing those troubles for us, their experience is going to be the opposite. And that's what Jesus says next at verse 24. Woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. So now, these three verses are actually unique to Luke. Matthew doesn't have anything like these woes, these warnings, because that's what these are. But the sentiment, of course, this is not the only place in the Bible that it appears. We actually saw it not too long ago in Psalm 49 and 73. That was kind of the lesson of those. It's also something the Apostle Paul is going to touch on in 1 Timothy chapter 6. The Apostle James is going to look at in James chapter 5. Put simply, you can't take it with you. That's what Jesus is building on here. So the people who have plenty in this life, they need to beware that they don't miss out on the next. And they really ought not to be gaining all the plenty that they have because they're taking that out of the mouths of other people. Because there's a real danger in this. There's a danger of, if people get rich, especially if they're hurting other people to do it, it teaches them to depend on themselves and to think that that's all they need is what they can provide. If they have that attitude, and then if they laugh at the idea of being accountable to God, it's going to leave them empty in the end. And they shouldn't count on other people telling them that they're doing a good job. Which is also, I think that's especially important for churches. Because there's a real temptation there. People's praise for us, though, it doesn't tell us very much. You have to actually think of that. If people are praising us, if they are happy with us, is it because we are telling them the sometimes painful truth of the nature of their broken relationship with God and helping them to find healing from that? Or is it just they're happy because we're telling them what they want to hear? Because there are a lot of churches that do that. And if a congregation is putting its opinions or the opinions of its culture ahead of God's will, then they're offering false teachings. We need to stay grounded in what the Lord has said, not what fits 2024 or whatever moment we happen to find ourselves in, because again, this does not last. And if we are offering false teachings instead, then we're going to receive the condemnation of the false prophets. We want to avoid that. That's why we need to stand on the truth that does not change. And so all of this is very much an otherworldly perspective that Jesus is offering. This is not what the world is looking for. And it doesn't stop here. What he says next continues it as well. At verse 27, I say to you who hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on the one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask for them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them likewise. But if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. In the blessings and warnings, Jesus presented some very revolutionary ideas in regard to the rich and poor. But just as unusual as those ideas is that he wasn't calling for a revolution. Because that's usually what happens. You have a lot of, you see it throughout history, you see it even today, that political leaders will step up and they'll tell their followers, there are good things, but they're being withheld from you by the rich. And then they encourage their followers to go and take those things, and by force, if necessary. So what Jesus is saying here is, that's not his program. We're to be prepared to suffer for love's sake as he did, not to seek revenge. Because that's what God could have done, have a perfect right to do so. But he didn't. So if we're following him, we shouldn't. Now, of course, we have to be careful of misunderstanding, because sometimes you can go too far the other way, I would say. This isn't saying to be a doormat. And it's not saying to make ourselves a target, to go out of our way in order to actually annoy people by the things that we do. There's a right way and a wrong way to present ourselves. But it's just recognizing the fact that we will be targeted because we're out of line. As far as the world is concerned, we have stepped out of line because we're not doing everything the way that they are doing it. And so they will crack down to try to get us back in line. And when they do, we need to continue to stand out passively, even as kind of an oxymoron as that might be. It kind of sounds like opposites, to stand out without trying to stand out. But that is what we do, just by not responding in a worldly way. When we don't do what they would expect us to do, when we are targeted by them, it shows we don't belong to this world, that we belong to heaven instead. And we're supposed to do that by treating those who hurt us the way we would want to be treated, rather than the way that they deserve. And of course, it goes a step further than that even, because it's not just withholding what they deserve, it's offering better. Because again, that's what God has done. The point that Jesus makes here about doing that and not withholding it from anybody, it actually made me think just about something that a lot of people are talking about more today with the idea of restricting speech. And that there are things that should just be illegal for people to say. But at the same time that they're trying to make up these rules, they also claim to respect free speech. Logically, that's inconsistent. If the only speech that you allow is speech that you like, then the speech is not free. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean that we do have to like it, but you can't call it free speech if you're doing that. It's the same kind of logical inconsistency here that Jesus is pointing out. You can't say that you're charitable if you're only getting charity in order to get charity back, that you're not actually helping anyone. If you only associate with the people that you feel comfortable with, you aren't actually sharing anything. Now, there's no problem with spending time with family and friends, obviously. It's just, like he says here, you don't get credit for doing what comes easy because that's just what everybody does. It's not a reflection of Christ's countercultural mission that looks so different from the world. We're supposed to know what we've been given, and then we're supposed to give it to others, no matter who they are, which is also the point, really, of what Jesus says next, what we find at verse 37. Judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be put into your bosom. For with the same measure that you use, it will be measured back to you. And he spoke a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into the ditch? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, Brother, let me remove the speck that is in your eye, when you yourself do not see the plank that is in your own eye? Hypocrite! First remove the plank from your own eye. Then you will see clearly to remove the speck that is in your brother's eye. Matthew includes this, again, some differences, but the same general idea in his version of the Sermon on the Mount as well. And this idea, judge not, has got to be one of, if not the most misapplied passages in all of Scripture. It's something that non-Christians and even some Christians just love to throw in our faces. Judge not. Jesus said to judge not. Yeah, what did it mean? What was he talking about when he said that? Because he never says to put aside discernment. This passage is actually about being discerning. The gospel is the message that salvation is available from the things that we have done wrong. That means you have to know that you have done things wrong in order to respond to it. If we're going to tell people that, which again, we have to, what he's talking about is what's supposed to be from the standpoint that we're in the same boat with them on that. To offer them the grace of the forgiveness that we have also received. The danger's in our perspective being skewed. Because if it is, then we'll see ourselves as better than others. And we'll ignore what's wrong with us. Because we're not seeing straight. And then when we do that, we might use it against those other people. We will use it against those other people. And one of the ways, maybe, this is like the most positive you can even remotely take out of it, is we might try to point out all the things that they are doing wrong in order to make ourselves the standard of behavior that they have to live up to and try to get them to do the same things that we do. Well, we're not the standard of behavior because we can never live up to God's. That's what we're supposed to understand. But of course, that's not even generally what people do, right? I mean, they maybe will to some extent, especially if people come to their church and they're like, okay, now you have to do everything the way that we do it. But no, really what happens is just for pointing fingers. Being able to make the comparison. Being able to say, well, at least I'm better than that guy, so God's got to be happy with me. That's all it's really for. And that's the judgmental attitude that Jesus is talking about, which is totally unjustified. We can only lead people to the truth if we see it about ourselves. If we don't, we're just going to drag them right into a ditch behind us. We are supposed to be showing them Jesus, because he's the great physician who gives sight to the blind. And we need to see our own situation clearly enough to do that, acknowledging that we need him before we even think about trying to fix others. It's not up to us, not even for ourselves, so certainly not for anybody else. It does still mean we have to point out, you've got the speck in your eye. But it's about being able to say, look at the plank that he pulled out of mine. That's the goal. And so after presenting all of this, Jesus begins to wrap down the sermon, and so that's what we find as it comes to an end starting at verse 43. He says, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruit. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of your heart the mouth speaks. But why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He's like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against that house, could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock. But he who heard and did nothing is like a man who built a house on the earth without a foundation, against which the stream beat vehemently, and immediately it fell. And the ruin of that house was great." The point of the sermon is that the followers of Jesus should have a peculiar character. It shouldn't just look like everybody else. And in particular here, it's that it's not enough to just claim to have that peculiar character. We should actually look like it. Now, of course, none of us is flawless. And that's not really the suggestion here. But it's about the fact that many people call themselves Christians just because it seems like the thing to do. It's kind of like a cultural expectation, a part of the family that they grew up in. They think they just kind of slot into that as a social club that they're basically part of. But Jesus is saying it needs to be deeper than that. And the things that we do and say, they build our actual reputation, not just what we call ourselves. And that's for good or ill. And so if we want to be building right, that means showing Jesus. Those who bear consistently bad fruit, they have to be told, at the very least, that their lack of production is worrisome. My favorite phrase, cliche really, for what Jesus says in verse 46 here especially, is you can sit in the garage all day, it doesn't make you a car. It's the same for Christians. You can sit in a church however long you want, that doesn't make you a Christian. Now, have to be absolutely clear on this. Salvation certainly does not depend on our behavior. Again, that's the whole point of not being able to judge people, is that we're no better than anybody else is. But our behavior should flow from our salvation. People who are grateful for what Jesus has done for them, you would expect them to listen to him. If they claim to be his, but they're not actually following him, then that gives no ground for confidence that they actually know him. Now, maybe they do. Because quite frankly, it's a decision between God and an individual. I can't read anybody else's mind. I can't look into their heart. And so maybe there is something there that I don't know of. But the point is, when we look around at other people and they say, yeah, I'm a Christian, and they're living in a totally unchristian way, we have to treat them as unbelievers, whatever the truth of their heart might actually be. And it's something that people need to be aware of for themselves, that if they've been calling themselves Christians, but they're not actually living like a Christian, then maybe they need to ask themselves what it is that they actually believe. Now, I don't want anyone to get depressed on me on the other side of this either, because that could be the opposite danger. We should and we can have assurance of our salvation. So you don't need to be constantly doubting it. If you're doing that, that ends up being a pretty empty way to live. It's not good, it's not comfortable, and it's not necessary. You have to ask yourself a couple questions. Do you believe that you are a sinner in need of grace and you're afraid to be left to your own devices? Or do you believe that you are a generally good person, and if you died today and stood in front of God and he asked you why you should be allowed into heaven, that you'd be able to say, well, you know, I treated people well, and I went to church, and I gave to a bunch of different charities? If that's your answer, then you're in trouble. It's that last one that's a problem, because it's actually only the former. It's the needy. It's those who will be left standing because they're standing on Christ. And that means they can't be moved, no matter what life throws at them. On the other hand, people who build on themselves, what they've done, they're the ones who will be swept away. So maybe somebody here or somebody watching this later online, you realize that you've called yourself a Christian without really knowing what that meant before. Or maybe you never even did call yourself a Christian, but you see now that it has something to offer that's different than what the rest of the world does. Either way, I hope you'll take it. And I hope you'll understand you can only do that by trusting in Christ. He died to make up for everything you are lacking. And then he rose to life again so that your needs could be satisfied forever. Now, the life of a Christian, I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's an easy one. Certainly not. But the point is that it's the only one that does lead to blessing in the end. And so I hope you'll enter it today by asking God for his forgiveness through Christ. That's all you have to do. That's all you can do. Everything else is going to leave you high and dry. So I hope you'll make that decision now. But if you are a believer, again, be comforted by the fact that you are, and then just commit to looking like it. That's what we're supposed to do. And the way that you do that is by treating others the way God has treated you. The blessings that he's bestowed are meant to be shared. And as you go about doing that, remember that you're no more worthy of those blessings than anyone, so they should be shared with everyone. Friend and foe alike. That's what we're here to do, to the glory of the Lord.